This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning to everyone and welcome to the Unitarian Church in Fall River this very bright and still cold Sunday morning. The theme of this service is to honor once again the efforts of Martin Luther King Jr. And in thinking about what I would say this morning and some reflections that I would like to make on his last words to everyone, his last sermon, I was struck by how much the message of that sermon, now over 50 years ago, still speaks to us, still challenges us today, and calls upon us to act, to get our hands dirty, as Jean-Paul Sartre would say, or as John Lewis would say, to get into good trouble, particularly at a time when there is so much philosophical and political division in this country, and the kinds of issues that Martin Luther King was concerned about, and in particular in this sermon, economic justice, but just as well before that, voting rights. And my wife, who was a civil rights attorney in the Justice Department in Washington, was an attorney who dealt with voting registration during the time when the Voting Rights Act was really in force. That act has been practically denuded by the Supreme Court, and now we're facing state legislatures throughout the country that are enacting rules that make it once again more difficult for people to exercise their right to vote. So those issues are still very much before us, and we don't have the tools that we once had to address them. So there's a lot to think about. Are there announcements this morning?
The announcement is that our continuing Course in Miracles continues on Zoom at 11 o'clock on Friday mornings. We're in 23, 24 countries. Our co-hosts are Richard Trudeau, MLK, what he's doing here, and Dave Ott, who's online, and Al Richo, is also online. for helping us to make that. But for those of you with psychological training, we'd be happy to know that the secret of the Course in Miracles is out. It's all about projection and introjection.
So I'd just like to tell everybody who's going to be our minister of the week. So thank you for being here today, Rob. And next week, we'll be hosting Ms. Kirk.
Any others? To begin our service, I will light our chalice. Flame that I have lit burns in each of us, burns brightly in each of us, and binds those here together into a single family that cares for one another, that stands behind one another, but who also cares for all those who are around us and in the community around us. Our first hymn is 149, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise and its singing rise. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Praising the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till to the victor is won. Zoning the ground we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughter. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us far on the way, thou who hast had thy might, let us into the light. Keep us forever in the path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land. Let us now share our affirmation with one another. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with our God. Let us join together in prayer of thanksgiving, that especially during this time of forced isolation, during the period of this pandemic, we are nevertheless connected to others beyond our immediate presence, those we know, those about whom we are concerned, those who are in need of our help and of our compassion. And we express that in these worship services by allowing us to speak of our particular unique connections to others, things about which we are concerned, but also things for which we feel joy, and both that we would like to share with one another. So I now invite those who have joys or concerns that they would like to share to do so.
I would like to give my joy, as I do every week, being here with the guys at the Unitarian Church. My life has been changing day by day. Every day when I wake up, I put my feet on the floor and I thank God. I say, wow, I'm here. And when I look at today, being Sunday here, I always look forward to coming to this church. I do the Zoom. I try to help people out. I feel blessed. I guess God's leading me in the right direction. I have a lot of moral support from Reverend Dr. David Ranke here, who gives me a lot of support. And Richard Stowe, same thing, inspiration. Sometimes I have those questions about who is God? What is God? What is this? What is that? Whatever it is, for some reason, they always seem to be able to give me an explanation, an understanding. And I feel proud and I feel good, and I have a lot of joy in my life now. Being alive, being well, and being surrounded by friends. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Just concern for those in this frigid weather who are out on the streets or in the doorways, no shelter at all. On the Bedford is pretty horrible. There are people sleeping on the streets today. So concerned about that, I'm worried about that.
I'm debating whether to share a concern for which, if anyone has any thoughts about how to deal with, I would appreciate it. But I don't know that many of you know, but we, over the past 3 years, my wife and I have had 2 dogs that we love dearly that grew up together, a Springer Spaniel poodle mix named Lulu and a dog that I brought over from France, Oscar, who's a Basset Fauve de Bretagne. They grew up together, and one morning last summer in August, we came downstairs and Lulu was non-responsive. She had died overnight, and she was only 3.5 years old. We don't know why, but she had had some seizures. And subsequently, my wife acquired a black lab, but Oscar, who was my heart and soul in November, on November 4th, he had epilepsy, and I would give him his medication 3 times a day. And his life, that care was very much part of the structure of my day, and I loved him. Both dogs were wonderful dogs with wonderful temperaments. We had taken them to the Cape early in the summer at Herring Cove Beach, and I have a picture. Lulu liked to dig these trenches, and I have a picture. She would dig this big trench, and she and Oscar are sitting in the trench looking out at all, and they were so well behaved. When they had a ball down there. But on that November 4th, Oscar had a seizure, which he would every month or 2 might have a seizure, but this went into status epilepticus and lasted for over a half an hour, and he finally expired. And that is the most painful experience that I've had, and I cannot get over his loss, or the both of their loss. So if anyone has any ways to overcome that, I don't expect to overcome it. I think of Oscar every day, all the time. I guess keeping him alive for me. Yes.
A story about a salesman who went to call on this elderly couple who's trying to sell them something, and the salesman didn't like that salesman sitting at the kitchen table, sitting at the table, he kept looking under the table. And the client said, "Well, folks, would you mind if you pet your dog, put a pet them until finish talking about what we're talking about?" And they looked at each other and they said, "There's my dog there. What does he look like?" They described their dog who had died some weeks before.
Yeah.
So he's still here.
Yeah, Oscar liked to crawl under the covers and get in bed and then lay his head on my thigh. He was a good boy. As we enter, yes.
And Elizabeth Whitehead says, "So sorry, a pet is a friend and family member, and only time really helps." Sends her blessing.
As we enter our silent meditations, we welcome the presence of others as they make themselves known to us. We bring them into our caring and into the fold of this congregation. We share their presence with one another silently. And at the conclusion of our meditation, We then join together in singing Spirit of Life, whose words express the essence of our faith and of our hope. So let us now enter into our own quiet meditation. We will sing Spirit of Life when we're finished. Our reading this morning are the words of Martin Luther King, Jr. Responsive reading that we will do, number 584, A Network of Mutuality. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There are some things in our social system to which all of us ought to be maladjusted. And bitterness can never cure the disease of fear. Only love can do that. We must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. Before it is too late, we must narrow the gaping chasm between our proclamations of peace and our lowly deeds which precipitate and perpetuate war. Seek what means by which we arrive at that goal. We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means. Those who continue to maintain an ethic of nonviolence and an ethic of peace and love in the face of conflict, in the face of injustice itself, are always hard pressed to deal with criticisms of them. King had to deal with that. Albert Camus had to deal with that, maintaining the importance of peaceful coexistence at times when people were filled with revenge. Our hymn is number 156, O Freedom. Oh, freedom, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my God and be free. No more moaning, no more moaning, no more moaning over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my God and be free. They'll be singing, they'll be singing, they'll be singing over me. And before I be a slave, I be buried in my grave and go home to my God and be free. Good job. Good singing. At this time, we welcome your gifts for the good works of this congregation. Thank you. On April 3rd, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, it was at Mason Temple. This was the world headquarters of the Church of God in Christ. It was here that Martin Luther King preached his last sermon. This was the day before he was shot to death by James Earl Ray on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in front of room 306. This is where King and Ralph Abernathy frequently would stay when they were in Memphis. King had come to Memphis as part of this Poor People's Campaign that he had organized with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. And the purpose was to address issues of economic injustice. And King had been traveling the country and was assembling what he referred to as this multiracial army of the poor. And the idea was that there would be a march on Washington to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience at the Capitol, to march, to be a presence there until Congress finally created an economic Bill of Rights for poor Americans. And being in the city of Memphis meant King was there as visible support of the Black sanitary public works employees. They have been on strike for higher wages and better working conditions, better treatment by the city government. The very last words that King himself spoke on that balcony before his assassination, they were spoken to a musician who had been scheduled to perform that night at an event King was attending. And he said to the musician, he said, "Ben, make sure you play Take My Hand, Precious Lord at the meeting tonight. Play it real pretty." The title of the sermon that King had given the day before on April 3rd was I See the Promised Land. And I want to share with you some of the words from that sermon with you, but especially to talk about their significance for what we face today as our country moves towards the presence of new leaders in control of the government. And I say new leaders because when you think about it, over the past 5 years, there have been 3 heads of government, 3 leaders of our government in that period of time. Not just 3 leaders, but 3 leaders with vastly different approaches to serving the people of the United States. One who saw a basis for hope, and as a first Black president, the possibility of reconciliation of discrimination and oppression between Black and white, followed by something who was virtually the antithesis of that, who at least exacerbated all the long-going and hidden tensions between Black and white and other racial entities, as much out of sheer ignorance of reality and the facts of reality as anything else, and followed by yet another leader who wants to try to reinstill a sense of hope, and in particular, a sense of compassion in his manner of government, but who faces a situation which is, I would say, far more complex than that Obama faced when he took office, which is something that social and, for that matter, environmental, cultural problems undergo, that they face because problems continually become more and more complex. There's something that I talked about in my book on post-disaster reconstruction after Katrina in Louisiana, what I called markers of complexity, but the increasing complexity of the problems that are facing, whether it be racial oppression, economic injustice, environmental degradation, I think are coming to the fore, that we are at the limits of our ability to deal with them, and we need to find new ways of addressing them. And perhaps there are, in the words of King's speech, some guidance in that. King had genuinely believed that his Poor People's Campaign was representing something new happening in the world. New because it was perhaps the first time that ordinary people had begun to find the power to address these gross economic injustices that existed, these inequities between the wealth of the few and the meager pay and the poor working conditions of the labor force. Now, we're more than half a century after King's movement to create this economic Bill of Rights. And we have to ask ourselves, because we're challenged to answer the question, have we in fact decreased the gap between the richest few and the rest of the population, or has that gap grown even more odious and severe? During the time, I find it interesting, when the United States was beginning to be an economic or a manufacturing presence in the world economy. And so I'm thinking of, let's say, the early 50s into the middle 50s, that there was far less of a gap between rich and poor. Now, how do I know that? Well, I was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan, and I knew the lives and the stories of all the players on the Brooklyn Dodgers, from Carl Furillo in right field, Duke Snyder. I have his autograph. My parents knew Duke Snyder. My favorite was Gil Hodges at first base. But nevertheless, I knew that in the offseason, these guys, they made a little bit more than the average working bloke would make. But over the winter, you know, they didn't go to Aruba or resorts. They were working in hardware stores, or one of them, I think it was, might have been third baseman Billy Cox. One of them worked as a mud digger in one of the tunnels that was being built under the river in New York. So that gap to me was, yeah, they had it a little better off, but not orders of magnitude better off, which is what we face today. So in this sermon, King reflected on this hypothetical possibility. What if he had the opportunity to stand at the beginning of time with this panoramic view of the whole of human history up to the present, and imagine the Almighty saying to him, because King's concept of God was a highly personal one, the Almighty saying to him, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? And King's response was rather curious. He said, well, first of all, he would take flight through Egypt and move on through Greece, even though that was a time when Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, Euripides, Aristophanes were assembled at the Parthenon discussing the great eternal issues of reality, but he wouldn't stop there. And he'd even go past the heyday of the Roman Empire and through the Renaissance, despite all that the Renaissance appeared to do for the cultural and aesthetic life of humankind. King wouldn't stop there, not even for the man for whom he was named. Pausing perhaps just to watch Martin Luther tack his 95 Theses on the door at the church in Wittenberg, but he wouldn't stop there. And even coming up to 1863, watching the vacillating President Lincoln finally come to the conclusion that he had to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, still King would not stop there. But finally, turning to the Almighty God, King would say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. A strange request to make King himself acknowledge, because the world as he saw it then was all messed up. He saw the nation as being sick, that trouble was in the land, confusion was all around. I mean, that was during particularly in the first part of the second half, the Vietnam War and all of the conflict associated with that. So King's was a strange statement. But King had this prophetic vision in which he felt that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. And King did see the Almighty. He saw God at work in this period of the 20th century. That God was, he believed, that was part of his faith, that God was at work in a way that humankind could respond, that something was happening in the world, that the masses of people were rising up. And King said that wherever people are assembled today, whether they're in Johannesburg, South Africa, or Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, Memphis, Tennessee. The cry was the same. We want to be free. We want justice in our freedom. So King saw this period of the latter part of the 20th century as one where humanity was at a point where we're now forced to grapple with the problems that humanity had been avoiding grappling with throughout all of history. Because it was becoming more and more patent that human survival now demanded that humanity grapple with them. Issues of war and peace, fairness in working conditions across all strata of society, human rights, understanding our natural environment. No longer was it possible to just talk about things. And that surely is where we are today. These are the questions we must grapple with. Now, for King, the focus had to be on the revolution in human rights. That is, if something was not done to bring people of color of the world out of their long years of poverty, their long years of hurt and neglect, the whole world was doomed. So that's why King was happy that God had allowed him to live in this period to see what is unfolding. That's why he was happy to be in Memphis. So just what was King's revolution? How did he see it? He didn't see it as one that was engaged in negative protest, negative arguments with anybody. Does that ring a bell with what we're experiencing today? A revolution of negativity? But for King, it was a revolution addressed primarily to people of color, that we're determined to be people, which is because we're all God's children in his mind. We don't have to live as we've been forced to live. So for King in his revolution of 1968, his message was that the oppressed people must stay together and maintain unity. The lack of unity between racially oppressed or racially marginalized groups is something my wife experienced when after she was civil rights attorney with the Justice Department in Washington, and then was special counsel for the state legislature of Louisiana. She was special counsel for the city of Springfield in Massachusetts, trying to get people of color, ethnic groups, a greater say, greater participation in the government. But to get the Black community and the Hispanic community to work together was a very difficult task. They maintained their separateness from one another. But King thought that unity among equally oppressed groups, even though from different cultures, was significant. So King would remind his followers of how whenever Pharaoh wanted to prolong slavery, the formula of the Pharaoh was to keep the slaves fighting among themselves. But when the slaves got together, Pharaoh couldn't hold the slaves in slavery. And so for King, the path towards freedom had to begin in unity. The second thing that King saw was that the path toward freedom had to keep the issues clear. And the issue was injustice, whether it was the refusal of the Memphis city government to be fair and honest in their dealings with its public servants, the ones who happen to be sanitation workers, or whether it was our issues today of economic inequities in society, or the question of how we live cooperatively with our natural environment. It was then, it is now, to keep attention on the injustice of those things. But today, we're plagued by a culture where what one person experiences as injustice is the same as what another claims to be their personal right, their personal freedom. That is a characterization of our dilemma. That is a level of the complexity of the problems that we now face that makes them intractable, that makes them so difficult to overcome. It's as if the equivocation, they're not even talking the same language. People are using words and they mean different things for each individual. Freedom and justice. But for King, the most meaningful act of his revolution was to march again and march yet again, to keep the issue of injustice before the public, to force people to see the suffering, the going hungry, the dark and dreary nights of poverty. And so we must ask, what is the best means for us today to put the issue of injustice before people? How do we portray injustice in a way that really makes a difference? Think back to 2011 and the protests against the perceived injustice on Wall Street in that September of that year, the public encampments on public parks and greens to make people aware of it. Did those encampments and the protests make any difference? We need to think about how we engage others in our concerns about injustice, and to be especially clever about how to make an impact. And it will likely need to go beyond marches, beyond protests of encampment, beyond tweets and Facebook posts, beyond YouTube's videos, which can be powerful expressions. We need to be aware that every protest against injustice offends those who are being or behaving unjustly, but who do not think they are, who think they're not being unjust. That equivocation. And the recent election suggests there are a lot of people who think their exclusionism or their covert racism is not unjust. People who, at least in their own minds, believe themselves to be quite just. All the Republican legislatures in those states that are rolling back the easier access to voting, think it's quite just, think the government has overreached itself. For King, there was an underlying faith that if we say to the nation, we know fairness is coming, he believed that people would get caught up with that which is right, that they would be willing to sacrifice for it. It's the same thing with vaccinations and wearing masks, that some people feel it is their God-given right not to be vaccinated, not to wear a mask, forgetting anything that has to do with you do those things out of compassion for others. You do those things to protect others, not simply as an exercise of your own freedom of choice, however stupidly that freedom may be framed. And this is where King's religious faith became practical. Fairness is coming was part of that faith. Justice will roll down like ever-growing streams. For King, there was this profound faith that there could be no stopping short of victory. It was echoed in Obama's words during his election, during his farewell address, "Yes, we can." This underlying faith of King to see people as ultimately able to act on the basis of fairness and justice, of the rightful place for all of God's people in the world, was crucial. Because today, as we face the problems our society faces, we must have that underlying faith. Faith in others to change, faith to act for the right, faith to discern what is the right, what compassion towards others consists of. And King was not going to let political thuggery stop him. So that's why for King, his revolutionaries had to be masters of nonviolence in disarming police forces. Even Birmingham in Alabama, when Bull Connor ordered the police to send the dogs forth, King's followers just went before the dogs singing, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round." For King, Bull Connor didn't know the history of faith. He couldn't relate to the spiritual power of justice that King's followers knew about. That faith that people would see a path to justice for all. Nothing could stop King's march to freedom. For King's followers, just as they went on before the dogs set upon them, just as they went on before the water hoses, they would look at them and go on singing that song, "Over my head, I see freedom in the air." And when they were thrown into paddy wagons and stacked there like sardines, they'd go into the paddy wagons singing, "We shall overcome." So it's significant that music was an expression of the spiritual power of justice. Because in singing together, music became one expression of this fact that the path to freedom needs all of you who seek justice, all who would minister to one another, all who would be like the prophet Amos and say, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." All who would minister to one another and say with Jesus, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to deal with the problems of the poor." All who would become as preachers to one another. Because for King, while it was all right to talk about the new Jerusalem, this new world to come, today's preacher of the path to justice and freedom had to talk about the new Atlanta, the new Philadelphia, the new Los Angeles, the new Memphis. That's what this clouded time in the 20th century represented. For King, those individuals on the path to justice or freedom had to develop a kind of dangerous unselfishness, what John Lewis called getting into good trouble. And King sometimes, and in this sermon, referred to the biblical story of when one day a man came to Jesus and raised questions about some vital matters in his life. And at times it seemed the man simply wanted to trick Jesus and show he knew more than Jesus, and through this to kind of throw Jesus off base. The man's questions could easily have ended up in philosophical debate, but King pointed out that Jesus immediately pulled the questions of this man out of the midair and put them back smack dab in reality. And in fact, put them on an actual dangerous curve that today still exists between Jerusalem and Jericho, where Jesus spoke about this certain man who had fallen among thieves and on that curve. You remember the story where a Levite and a priest passed by on the other side, and they didn't stop to help the man who was robbed. But finally, a man of a different race came by, a Samaritan, and he got down from his beast and decided to be compassionate on the spot. Not by proxy, not by making some quote unquote statement of conscience or by contributing some money. But Jesus ended the story saying this was the good man because he had the capacity to be concerned about his brother. He had directly projected his I, let's say, into the thou of the other, put himself in the other person's position. Now, one could concoct some justification for why the priest and the Levite didn't stop by to help. Perhaps they were busy going to political meetings or to church meetings. Perhaps they had to get on to Jerusalem so they wouldn't be late for their meetings. Perhaps there was some law that said a person engaged in his own righteous work need not touch another human body. Perhaps they felt they had to first analyze the problem before getting involved with their own individual effort. But King's own voice told him that he thought these men were just afraid. Because the actual Jericho road was then and still today is a dangerous road. It's a winding, meandering road, a road that's really conducive for ambushing. The priest and the Levite, looking over the man on the ground, might have wondered if the robbers were still around, or perhaps they thought the man on the ground was merely faking, acting like he had been robbed and hurt in order to lure them there and seize them himself, like one of those British ballads. The first question the Levite asked was, "If I stop to help this man, what will happen to me?" But when the Good Samaritan came by, he reversed that question, saying, "If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him?" And so the question before us today is not if I stop to fight for justice in seeking a cooperative relation, not only with our neighbors to the north, like Canada, but our neighbors to the south, Mexico, justice in seeking a cooperative relation with other species in the natural world, justice in seeking equitable compensation for the workers of industry as well as the chief executives, justice ending the brutal violence of one individual against another. What will happen to all the hours that I must spend in my office every day? The question is not, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? The question is, what will happen to him? If we do not stop to help these injustices, what will happen to the world? That's the question. So I want to conclude with King's own final words in this last sermon. King said, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." Our concluding hymn is number 199, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. My way grows drear, precious Lord, linger near. When we go out in peace, remember that for the time being, it is still necessary to wear our masks when we are inside in public places, to practice good hygiene, washing our hands frequently, but to be compassionate when we go out, so that when we do go out, to remember, let's be careful out there. But everyone must be careful. So we will now hear your choral amen.
For the post-loop, I'm going to sing the number 2 on the Thomas A. Dorsey hit parade. Number 1 was Precious Lord, Take My Hand. This one is Peace in the Valley. And Thomas A. Dorsey, who's an interesting guy, not to be confused with Tommy Dorsey, the trombone player. Thomas A. Dorsey was a black man originally from Georgia. Most of his life in Chicago. Was for quite a while, he was a piano playing blues man. He was pretty low down. He played Campo Red, and but he had an epiphany. His wife and daughter died in childbirth, and that kind of got to him. He had already been composing, and he ended up with this kind of a gospel machine. He he had his own publishing company. He wrote Precious Lord, Take My Hand for Mahalia Jackson in 1938. She was kind of one of his proteges. So anyway, this one was actually Elvis's favorite gospel song here. So here we go, Peace in the Valley. Peace in the valley. Peace in the valley. All right.
Thank you.